school teacher in the Old North End of Burlington. And we've invited you here today to have the opportunity to speak directly to you, people making decisions right now about our lives and the lives of the children we teach and care for and love dearly. These past 3 weeks, teachers and directors from around Vermont have been vocal about our concerns with the governor's decision to end stabilization money last night and effectively force programs to open today. Generations of neglectful funding for our field means that early ed was in a financial crisis long before the entire country went into a COVID-19 economic recession. We were relieved and so grateful that the state understood that if early ed wasn't supported to stay afloat, many programs would financially drown and never come back. We are both thankful for that support and concerned that it was taken prematurely. While we appreciate the work of advocacy organizations of the Child Development Division, the Department of Health, the governor, and many, many other people, we're also cognizant of how we have felt left out of this planning. The people who have made these decisions that dramatically influence the lives of teachers, directors, our kids, their families, are not expected to go back to work today wearing a face mask and oversized shirts to care for tiny humans with little ability to follow any of the public health mandates, knowing that this deadly virus spreads through the very thing that keeps young children alive, touch and physical closeness. They were not expected to do that because they don't work in childcare programs in schools for young children. We do. And yet no one has asked us if any of the mandates will work, if they'll be effective, if they'll be physically feasible, if they'll be emotionally feasible, or if they'll be developmentally harmful. So in light of not being asked to join your table, we're inviting everyone to join ours. And we're really, really appreciative of you for coming. I want to acknowledge Dr. Mark Levine, the Commissioner of Health, Ken Schatz, the Commissioner of the Department of Children and Families, Stephen Berbecco, the Deputy Commissioner of DCF's Child Development Division, Melissa Regal-Garrett, the Child Development Division's Policy Director, Brina Holmes, Maternal and Child Health Director at the Department of Health, Michael Sorokin, Chittenden County Senator and the Chair of the Senate's Committee on Economic Development, and Lindsay Curley, the Secretary of the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. I'm very sorry if I didn't pronounce your name correctly. You can correct me later if you want. And while President Pro Tem Tim Ash wasn't able to join the call, we had the opportunity to speak with him earlier today. We also requested the president of Governor Scott, but unfortunately we didn't hear back from him. So today our format will begin with a group of teachers and directors sharing their perspectives as well as sharing stories from others. We will then invite teachers and directors to directly ask questions to our guests. And lastly, we'll open things up to give the press an opportunity to ask questions to our guests or to the teachers and director speakers. A couple of logistics, if you can, I think everyone's done this. We all have like very good Zoom etiquette now, but if you mute your mic, unless you're talking, that's really helpful to reduce background noise. As people have done, members of the press, if you wouldn't mind keeping your video off, and folks who are here to answer questions, we'd love if you wanted to have your video on. And finally, before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that while we're here together, there are people throughout the country and throughout the world outside right now in the streets expressing their grief and anger and disappointment at this country, a country that was established by European immigrants who stole this land from indigenous peoples and then kidnapped and enslaved African descendant people to work it. People are uprising because we live in a place where white people terrorize Black people with impunity, a place where police terrorize Black people with impunity. We live in a country where police officers paid by our taxes steal life from Black people in the middle of the day, in the middle of the street, because they can. I want to acknowledge, as the teachers of young children, as a Vermont workforce of predominantly white women, we have deep entanglements and deep responsibilities to use our classrooms as tools to help heal ourselves and each other, and to try to help raise a generation of people who understand that racism, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness is something we can understand, we can discard, and we can replace. So I want to take a moment of silence to honor the lives of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, just to name a few of the most recent Black lives taken by the police and white folks. Now I want to introduce our first speaker, Sonia Raymond, the Executive Director of the Vermont Association for the Education of Young Children.
Thank you, Emma. Good afternoon, and thank everyone for joining the call today. As she said, I am the Executive Director for Vermont AEYC. I'm also the owner of Apple Tree Learning Centers here in Stowe, Vermont, and we are open today to our families for the first time. For all of them, which has been a very exciting day for us, and a very busy one. I want to help people understand that our mission with Vermont AEYC is to advocate for early educators and the children and families that they serve, as well as to provide and promote supports for the profession and the development of early childhood programs and quality programs. As was just mentioned, this is really unprecedented times that we are in here, and the state has been incredibly generous, providing financial supports that are intended to help the early childhood education programs remain alive and to assist them in reopening. We're well aware that there's no other state that has actually held up childcare in quite the same way as Vermont has, and this is greatly appreciated. While this support has been incredibly helpful, it's also further highlighted the need for a couple of things. One is the need for ongoing supports with a transition out of COVID through to the end of the year and ongoing into the future to ensure that we have accessible, affordable, and quality early childhood programs. This does not happen without a well-qualified,
So Sonia, you became muted.
I'm sorry, I must have hit something. I don't know what the last word you heard.
The last thing you said was talking about needing well-qualified
workforce.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you, yes. Apologize for that. So this doesn't happen without having a well-qualified and well-compensated workforce. So not only are we going to continue to need supports to allow our programs to open over time and in the proper way so that they can continue to sustain for their staff and for the families that they serve, but we're going to need to continue beyond with further investments in order to maintain and sustain the early childhood system. Even before COVID, through our work with Vermont AEYC and particularly around our work with advancing as a profession, we'd seen the need for a representative group of the workforce to act as more an advisory group, if you will, to the state agencies and statewide stakeholders. This group of early childhood educators would work with agency folks such as the Child Development Division, all of you, AOE, Department of Labor, stakeholders such as Let's Grow Kids, Building Bright Futures, Head Start, to have their opinions, suggestions, and expertise heard and incorporated into the creation and revisions of supports and regulations and policies in the future. It should be represented by a diverse group of folks from all regions, all types of programs, and all positions within those programs. VACE's actually heard from many of the programs and early educators and stakeholders about this need, and we've talked about how we will be able to support this work moving forward in the future. So I look forward to hearing from all of you and to working with this group and other early educators as we move forward to support them through our organization.
Thank you, Sonia. Next, I'd like to introduce Johnny Flood, a preschool teacher who's going to be talking a bit about the moment we're in from the perspective of teachers.
Thank you, Emma. Again, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for being here. Yeah, my name is Johnny Flood. I'm a preschool teacher in Montpelier. And over the past few weeks, I have been engaged in some challenging and confusing conversations with many of my colleagues about reopening plans and procedures, about safety, about the sustainability of our program and of our industry, and frankly, from where I'm standing and sitting and working, about money. The reality is that most teachers in my position are low wage workers, working paycheck to paycheck. They're working to support their families. They're working underinsured or without health insurance altogether. And they're mostly women, women who have to refuse raises and who have to cut back their hours in order to continue to qualify for Medicaid. And so they don't face exorbitant monthly healthcare premiums. You know, we're working people who don't have the luxury to choose whether or not we can go into work. We don't have the luxury to choose, and we can't choose, even though we understand that all the public health guidelines being presented to us, social distancing, small group sizes, limited time indoors, consistent mask use, these are nearly impossible to implement in our work. Our work is to wipe noses, is to change diapers, is to dry tears and give hugs all day, because that's what children need. You know, in our work, we don't have plexiglass dividers and one-way aisles. Despite the close contact nature of our work, all we have in the way of protection is homemade cloth masks, masks that don't particularly protect the wearer from airborne viruses. And we have extra shirts worn as smocks. You know, we don't have gowns, face shields or medical grade respirators. And in returning to work now, we know because of our exposure that we're putting our elderly and immunocompromised loved ones at risk. You know, we know all that. We're in the field, we're professionals. We know what it entails. And yet we have bills and rent to pay. We have car payments to make. We have groceries to buy. And so right now we find ourselves preparing and planning as quickly as we can to welcome children back into our care. And the other side of it is that I know many parents who look to me and look to my coworkers for our professional knowledge, for answers to their questions about their children. And right now, I feel often at a loss. I have no satisfactory answers for parents for, say, their questions about multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. I don't know. We don't know enough about it. I can't explain to parents why it's safe to bring their 2-year-old to school without a mask, but their 7-year-old still has to stay home. I don't know. I have no good answer for that. And frankly, I have to tell parents that in my professional opinion, the masks and social distancing recommendations are not developmentally appropriate for our age groups. And as such, they won't be followed by our children, and they won't be keeping their children safe. And that's a big responsibility. That's our priority. Parents bring me their infants, their toddlers, their 4-year-olds every day, trusting that I am going to keep them safe. And right now, frankly, I feel forced into coming back to work prematurely and underprepared. And I worry quite a bit that my presence back in the classroom serves as a tacit endorsement that it's safe to return, when in reality, I have serious misgivings. And I feel like I'm only returning because I'm a worker. I'm working class, and that's my responsibility. That's what I have to do. And I'm not alone. One teacher we surveyed spoke of her fear and frustration of feeling like guinea pigs. She felt like the government was putting women and children on the front lines. And this was a widely shared fear in our survey. Another teacher spoke of being absolutely terrified that our youngest citizens were being treated as the canaries in the mines. And she wrote, the threat of the virus is enough to keep public schools and summer camps closed, but for some reason, preschool teachers and children from birth to 5 are disposable. You know, I'm humbled every day by the strength and the grit of the women I work with, of their patience, their empathy, and their skill for raising Vermont's children. These are people who are proud to serve their communities and who don't shy away from hard work and from sacrifice. They don't. But you can only ask so much. You know, a woman who runs a childcare program out of her home wrote to us and she said, I feel I have no choice about whether to reopen since we will need the income. I have asthma and 3 children of my own. My husband already works at a doctor's office. We feel stuck and like we have no choice but to reopen, even though it means an increased risk of exposure, both for us and the children. It feels like the economy is being put before the people. And I have to ask the economy, whose economy is that? You know, like I said, we work paycheck to paycheck. We don't have health care. We're low wage. And so when the Scott administration proposes over $50 million to the UVM Medical Center, that's an important package, as part of an important package to rescue and stabilize the Vermont medical system. I see that, I understand that. But I have to find myself wondering, will John Brumstead, their CEO, he makes over $2 million a year. Will he be taking a pay cut? Will he be making that sacrifice during these times? You know, will the top 5% of income earners in Vermont, who have saved about $250 million a year since the 2018 federal tax cuts, will they be locally taxed and asked to pass those savings on to nurses, grocery store workers, mail carriers, and childcare professionals? Well, is that a sacrifice that they're going to make? Or will working families, workers, and children, babies, will they be asked to make the sacrifices, to put themselves in harm's way for the sake of a state and national economy that, as we see it, continues to reward its richest residents? I happen to believe that there is a safe and responsible way to reopen. There's ways to do it, and it's important, and we understand that. But we have to do it the right way. And as Vermonters, we owe it to our children and to our families and to our workers to do this the right way. So that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. The next person who's going to speak is Heather Martin. She's the owner of Baby Steps, an infant and toddler program in Proctor.
Hi, everyone. I have a lot to go over, so I'm going to try to be as brief as possible, but try to touch on all the points. My piece is a little bit two-part. My family actually had COVID, so I have the perspective of a family that's been through it and a childcare provider. In addition, I have been a director for 15 years, so I'm pretty familiar with the struggles of staff and small business and things like that. So I'm going to start by just touching on like a few things about the COVID experience, and then kind of get into talking about the field and some of the concerns that directors have had around the state. So my whole family was hit with it in March, and every single one of us, ages 9 through 41, 6 of us were hit. My 9-year-old son actually had symptoms of MIS-C. He had the bloodshot eyes and the fever and the fatigue. I had no idea at the time that that could possibly be it. The only person that had been tested in our house was my husband. So I remember laying on the couch sick and looking at the statistics that said, Vermont had 2 cases in Rutland County, knowing that there were 6 cases sitting in my house. It was terrifying. My 13-year-old son asked me every day, constantly for 2 weeks, am I going to die? Is mom going to die? Is dad going to die? I had no idea. So, I tried to be as reassuring as possible. So it's just, I think that we just need to be aware of that as we're now opening up the floodgates, so to speak, and having families possibly get exposed. I know Vermont has, I think, 35,000 cases within an hour's drive of our border, and we have kids go back and forth for custodial arrangements. So with centers opening, it's gonna hit our centers. There's also things that we don't know. My family was lucky, and we seemed to recover, but just 2 weeks ago, my daughter with diabetes still tested positive for COVID. So nobody knows what that means. Health department, we don't know. I don't know. So there's a lot that we don't know, and I think that we need to take stock in that before we expose our families. Do we have a plan for what happens if parents are getting hospitalized. So, and it really made me wonder about herd immunity. I don't know if that's actually a thing or if that's something that we can bank on. So we have done a phenomenal job flattening the curve. That's great. It gave me hope, and we've done a lot of things right so far. And I just think that we need to continue to build on those things. Personally, my program wasn't able to open today. I have a tiny infant program, and too many of my staff actually fall into that at-risk category. And having been through the illness myself, I just am not comfortable asking them to come in and risk their lives. One of the reasons would be because we don't have full gowns of PPE. We don't have face masks and shields. And we are in extremely close contact with children. My particular program serves ages 6 weeks to 2 years, which is the youngest group with no face masks. And not to be gross, but we deal with bodily fluids all day. So changing your shirt really doesn't protect you from COVID. And I do think it's important that we have safety guidelines. I totally agree with that. But we need to be realistic in that changing your shirt isn't going to protect you from COVID. My family got it from an asymptomatic person that had no physical contact. So that does terrify me as to what that would do to a classroom full of children if we have asymptomatic spread. So in addition to all of this, I actually am on the Vermont AUIC Board of Directors, and I have served as a consultant for new programs, most recently in the Castleton University campus, and that program is actually on hold now due to the pandemic. So I've done extensive financial planning for centers, and I have to say our industry has reached a breaking point. Our cost of operation now exceeds our revenue. So it was kind of hanging by a thread before the pandemic. So I just wanted to touch on that because I know there's been a lot of push, like, providers, you guys have received some funding. Why do you need ongoing funding? So I have, an example of kind of what happens when our teachers lose healthcare and things like that. So I'll get to the examples in a minute. I know for myself, before the pandemic, it wasn't uncommon for directors to occasionally go without paychecks or to leave hours off of our timesheets on purpose to basically sustain a center at a cost to ourselves. I've done it myself, and I know multiple other directors that have done it. Our staff make very low wages. So it's really been balanced on our backs for years. So we have nothing left that we can really cut to offset the higher cost of living, other than higher cost of operation, other than huge tuition increases, and our parents can't afford that. So we want our industry to succeed. We miss our kids, we love our coworkers, and we know our parents are worried about their jobs, but we can't underestimate the brutality of this virus and how much it costs to keep it out of group care. The asymptomatic spread can easily infiltrate childcare. It already goes through group homes, which don't have 10 to 20 clients sitting in a room for 8 to 10 hours all day, touching absolutely everything like children do. So really quick, if you have a full-time teacher making like $14 an hour, and I've seen situations like this happen, if they lose their Medicaid health insurance and their childcare subsidy, the cost for childcare tuition for 2 kids and the cost of the Vermont Health Connect fee added together, I have a real example that actually cost a family $3,000 a month. And at $14 an hour, her actual salary was $2,400. So she literally couldn't afford to work. So those are the kind of huge disparities that we're talking about. So, we have no interest in being selfish and trying to advocate and be pushy when we know everyone needs money at the moment, but just the math literally doesn't add up. So we can't possibly open our businesses without sustained funding to access the supplies that we need and cover the payroll gaps that we have right now. So there were some quotes that we had from directors that really echoed a lot of the stuff that I just touched on. I'm not going to hit everything because I want to try to wrap it up. But just that childcare directors really fear for health and safety of employees and children, really need an adequate and sustainable way to procure PPE. And that we just want to see at the table directly as policies are being drawn up rather than being represented by the agencies. Like it's good to have agencies as well, but there really is a representation difference when you have providers that are actually on the front lines doing some of the planning and being part of the dialogue. That's it for me for now.
Thank you, Heather. Next, I'd like to introduce Keegan Alba, a parent of 2 young children.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks for everyone for making time for this today. Today, I am speaking on behalf of the Coalition of Families for Vermont's Future, a group of parents, caregivers, and educators deeply concerned about the state's plan to reopen childcare centers on June 1st. While we feel strongly that those programs that can safely reopen should be supported and incentivized in doing so, we also believe the current model for reopening will leave many families and providers without options and may well contribute to a collapse of the field across the state. We are here in solidarity with the teachers and directors from early childhood through higher education taking a stand against regressive cuts to our education system, and with the hundreds of educators who flooded the governor's office with letters asking for more time and support to address the crisis. As of today, there have already been reports of a COVID outbreak at a childcare center here in Vermont, while other long operating programs have begun to explore or move forward with plans to close for good. In recent weeks, the Early Learning Center at St. Michael's College and the Campus Children's School at the University of Vermont announced their permanent closures. Although I'm aware both centers reported years of running a deficit as one of the primary reasons for their closures, I imagine the economic impact of the current pandemic heavily influenced their final decisions. I also imagine the closures of additional childcare centers will follow. The reality of our circumstance is clear. We need more help. The idea that the childcare industry has already gotten their share is a fallacy based upon the shaky structural foundation of a market-based system. Vermont is already an expensive, challenging place to raise a family, with limited career options and very few childcare spots. Many of the centers working toward reopening operate on razor-thin margins, and while the Restart grants provided are appreciated, they do not begin to cover the financial losses they will encounter in the face of decreased capacity with fewer teachers and families participating. We do not know what the future of COVID-19 in Vermont will be. We do know that without additional support, our system of early childhood care and education may not have a future. The current reopening plan also generates questions around equity. One parent shared, "My child has a chronic severe respiratory illness. His pediatrician has recommended that he not return to school. However, we remain responsible for his and his sister's tuition, or we forfeit their spots, which are hard to come by. We will have to pay over $2,000 a month to secure them, while also having to take time off from work to care for them at home. This is an impossible situation, and we're some of the fortunate people with the resources to continue doing this. Many other families cannot. This is an equity issue. Some parents have a lot more choice than others, and disproportionately low-wage working parents are being put in the hardest position. Choose between keeping one's job, typically in high-exposure environments, and making a decision to return kids to childcare, even though they may not feel safe in doing so. The choice to reopen centers without a plan in place to support families and educators who cannot safely return, to provide educators with the professional support and safety net they deserve, or to ensure equitable access to available spaces, puts the entire sector at risk. The governor regularly calls out state's demographic crisis, but if we do not put children and families at the center of our decision-making process, the long-term outlook for our state is bleak. During a press conference in April, Governor Scott asked the legislature to work together on a statewide plan to rethink, reform, and strengthen our entire education system from cradle to career. If we truly hope to accomplish this task, our state must actively step up its support for families and the education systems as a whole and invest in our shared future. As parents of young children, we ask that the state extend stabilization funding to provide centers and parents with the time and resources they need to work out equitable, safe plans that center the health around around the health and safety of our children and communities. In that same press conference, Scott also said, "I believe it is possible for Vermont to emerge from this crisis on a path toward having the very best education system in the country and ultimately in the world." Speaking as a parent and former educator, I agree with Scott's words, but I believe that path starts with a larger investment in early childhood education. There is still time to act. Please stand today with educators, families, and children in committing to a future where we can all thrive. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Keegan. And our last speaker before we move into sharing a little bit about our vision and then asking some questions is Kelly Hackett, a registered home childcare provider.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I am a registered home childcare program. I am also the starting points leader for Waterbury. So I have a network of many providers that I work with on a regular basis and stay connected with. So today was the first day for many of us to be opening, and I too was one of the opened programs. And it also happened to be the same day that supplies were provided to families or provided to providers this evening in Colchester. One of my network members went to pick up for all of the members in our group, and she got there at 4:30, and by 4:45 the soap was gone. So providers have been working very hard to support one another during this entire closure. We have remained connected and sharing of ideas and strategies and tools on how to work through this pandemic and work through how to access supplies. We are forever grateful for all of the financial support that has happened, as well as the support for supplies. But based on today, we'll continue to need that support ongoing. I know every time I've gone to the grocery store, I've looked for cleaning supplies and there hasn't been any. Many providers are very worried about getting violations because they're not doing enough sanitizing and cleaning and wearing the masks. And so they are very cautious of how they are performing and not feeling like they're able to engage with the children because they're walking behind them all and cleaning. I have a few stories from many providers that have that I'll just share. So one provider says that I have been open the whole time to essential families, and I'm more nervous now about opening and adding more children than I was being opened earlier. Providers are also questioning why during the height of COVID did they not need to wear PPE, and now when cases are low, PPE is required. Another provider has shared, I'm worried I won't be able to meet the necessary health guidelines and provide the best care to the children if I am wiping surfaces all day, changing my clothes, washing my hands for 20 to 30 seconds every 20 minutes. I will be cleaning for the 2 hours and washing my hands for 90 minutes. So I am left with a few hours to change diapers, feed children, put them down for their naps, and plan safe activities to lead circle all by myself, all while wearing a cloth facial covering, which restricts oxygen intake and increases carbon dioxide intake. Many parents have also expressed their concerns to providers that they're worried about providers' health being in jeopardy for wearing facial masks all day. In addition to the health concerns, families see COVID as a less risk for some, and their child's social emotional health as a greater risk. For the infants, as you know, for Heather Martin, where she was saying infants really rely on facial expressions, and as do 2, 3, and 4-year-olds. It's very difficult for children to see and recognize our emotion and under facial masks. I've worked with a few nurses, and they have been trying to come up with facial coverings that are see-through. And today I did try one out, and it just felt like I was being suffocated. So another provider has shared that how to allow children to play and learn in a way that is developmentally appropriate, while also keeping kids, myself, families safe and healthy. I also have 2 family members that live in my house that are at the higher risk for complications, as well as 5 of my own children. And I worry about them as well. I'm also a bit worried about having to take 2 weeks unpaid because I don't feel like I can be open to homeschool my 3 school-aged children, especially when there is only a couple of weeks left of school. So a lot of home providers have school-aged children, and so they're working on helping their children finish up the last 2 weeks of school, as well as caring for a multi-aged group of children in their home. Another provider has shared, I have families dropping out left and right because they feel it is too soon to safely return to group care. I need more time to fill these slots. Please continue to support us, or the funds you gave us earlier will have been for nothing. For providers opening up on June 1st, many of them are opening up with many vacancies, which is a huge cause for concern. While the Restart grant is wonderful, it is not covering the income loss to those programs. I know for my own program, I am able to have up to 6 children, and I only had 4 children. So the income, and not only that, but a lot of home providers are also providing after school care for children, and that was also an income loss during this closure period because they were not compensated for the after school slots. Another provider has shared, if we are so important for the economy, then tell me how do you plan to survive? How do you plan to survive the pandemic and thrive beyond it? Many early childhood educators do not have health insurance and cannot afford the Health Connect insurance. Many are concerned about getting sick while COVID may be covered, but the other illnesses are not. What are some of the implications from what folks would like to know? What are some of the implications of wearing PPE for 10 hours a day? Also, early childhood educators typically work through illnesses because they cannot afford to take a sick day or flip for a doctor bill. One way to support early childhood education is through quality, affordable healthcare. I know for our family, we cannot afford the Health Connect, and we have gone without health insurance for 2 years now. And just fingers crossed that we don't get really sick and don't get hurt. Some providers are questioning the reasoning for wearing a mask in my own home. I'm not wearing a mask during off hours, and the moment the children leave, my mask comes off. I have heard that some people have heard that young children are stoppers of the virus, and they're not spreading it, but they'd like to hear more about that kind of data. But really, what is the mask doing if we're just taking it off? Aren't the water droplets still in the air when we're in our homes? A lot of these providers don't have separate spaces as well, so they are in their living room, in their kitchen, and all throughout the main part of their house. So the water droplets are there. I feel another provider has shared, I feel like I am starting up a new business all over again, but instead of being excited, I'm really anxious, writing new policies and procedures, and that frankly sounds scary. I worry that I will get a violation because I'm not sanitizing, temperature checking, mask wearing, or practicing social distancing. This is a lot of work and I'm unsure that it is financially viable. My only hope is that people realize that now is the time for investing in the future by supporting early childhood educators. So, thank you for supporting us thus far, and we appreciate it, but I think the work is not done.
Thank you, Kelly. Next, I want to introduce Isla Bristol, a teacher at a early ed program in Montpelier.
Thanks, Emma. Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your days to be here. While we don't currently have time to go into detail, we felt it was important to share our general vision for what a safe return may look like. Moving forward, we would greatly appreciate speaking to some or all of you in a different format to discuss this vision further. But for now, broadly, we understand that the following things would be essential for a sustainable reopening. Firstly, continued stabilization funding that enables and supports a staggered reopening and that covers the lost income of low enrollment, the increased costs of potential additional hiring, extensive health and safety equipment, and mandatory smaller group ratios, 1:4 for preschool, 1:3 for toddlers, 1:2 for infants. And beyond funding, we need accessibility to free COVID-19 testing for early ed communities, families, teachers, and directors, adequate medical grade personal protective equipment provided to all teachers, guaranteed unemployment for at-risk teachers, clear and mandatory statewide protocols for illness-induced closures, and hazard pay. Finally, it's been touched on a few times already, but something that must be reiterated is that we are a chronically uninsured and underinsured profession. And while that fact has been a constant source of stress and hardship amongst the teaching community, during this health crisis, our collective lack of sufficient health care makes our jobs particularly hazardous. We acknowledge that this is not DCF's responsibility, nor is it CDD's. We would like to work in partnership with you, along with our legislators, to ensure the health and safety of our dedicated, essential workforce. Thank you.
Thank you, Isla. So now we're going to move into asking some questions. We invited you all here today, both to the opportunity to let you hear from us directly the positions we're in right now, and to also have the opportunity to ask you questions that we haven't been able to get answers through in other ways. So unless a question is directed to a specific guest, feel free to please just answer the question that pertains to you and your sphere of influence and your job. And if you'd like to answer, if you could just raise your hand so everyone else knows that you're able to respond. If multiple people want to answer, I'll just call on someone. Ideally, everyone would have a chance to speak today. So Kelly Hayes, do you want to begin?
Sure. The first question that we have for you today is, why are early education centers going back at 100% capacity, but other businesses can only return to 25% capacity? Who'd like to take that on?
Great, Stephen, thank you.
Thank you for that question, Kelly. Good afternoon. I guess it's good evening now, everyone. And thank you, Emma, for this invitation to join the table and to have frank and direct conversation about childcare. Before I get to your question, Kelly, I want to say that I've really enjoyed the conversation and I've learned from it. I've been taking notes and I look forward to following up with the presenters. There are several things that were brought up that I'd love to learn more about. And I recognize that there's limited time. I want to respect everyone's time in the current conversation. Kelly, you asked about why it is that childcare, the closure on childcare has been relaxed or lifted by order of the governor at this point, whereas other businesses don't have the same opportunity to open. And my understanding is that that's really in CDD, we very much follow the lead of our colleagues in the Department of Health. We rely on their understanding of the data and science around this virus and how it affects us. So if it'd be all right, I'd like to ask Dr. Levine to speak to his understanding of the health and safety guidelines for childcare.
Sure, I think I've unmuted. I want people to keep in mind the mission of the Vermont Department of Health, which is to protect and promote the health of all Vermonters. And certainly our Maternal Child Health Division would reiterate that with the youngest Vermonters in mind. And I very much appreciate the heartfelt comments that have been made here tonight, and I can hear the emotions. I hear a little ambivalence as well, but certainly strong emotions about concerns and dealing with really an epidemic none of us asked for. And many are facing with genuine fear and certainly a sense of uncertainty about the future. I do know that this pandemic has really exacerbated fundamental issues in the system that you work in. And you've already detailed very well the undercompensation issues, the affordability issues, etc. The additional issues now are new guidance, sort of new hoops to jump through, as I guess I would describe it, new obstacles to climb over. And really, our role in the Department of Health is to really prioritize and to promote and have confidence in the health and safety measures. And we've had a good experience with the limited opening of childcare, providing for the essential workers. In fact, we've had an excellent experience with that, and I think it's gone very smoothly. Most things we do at the health department align very well with the Centers for Disease Control. And we are now at that stage in reopening, if you will, that's known as phase 3, which is about as advanced as one could be. And we're a state that has a very, very low prevalence of disease right now, very little viral spread, and a strong public health system in place to contain possible future outbreaks. And so we really do feel that the childcare system's not opening from scratch, it's already opening from a position of strength, in a position that's actually a little further along than many other sectors have been, and feel comfortable that it could open further at this time, along with all of the health and safety guidance that would be put into place. And that's been a very, I think, strong process, part of what's gone on. I know that there's been a sense that there wasn't a lot of engagement very early on, way back in the beginning, so to speak. But I think over many, many weeks now, there's been a very strong process of engaging the community, getting feedback, responding to the feedback, creating, if you will, a very iterative process. I know there's some concerns that schools and camps are not on the same timeline, but if you think about it, camps are now, and they are actually going through a very rapid process at this point. And schools, the commitment was already made to have schools closed till the fall, and there's a very robust effort going on with schools that I think mirrors the effort that was going on with childcare, with the appropriate lead time now for schools. So one shouldn't feel that childcare is a special case, if you will, because schools are really right in line and undergoing the same process.
I'm just going to jump in. I just want to ask it maybe again, Kelly's question. Thank you for everything you just shared. We're really specifically interested in why very young children with very little impulse control can be back at full capacity, but grown-ups who are able to social distance businesses can only return to 25. I'm interested if you're able, that's something that we've struggled to find answers to. And I'm wondering if you'd be able to speak to that specifically.
Yeah, so some of the recent science looks at the way viruses passed from children to adults versus adults to children. And more of it is now actually showing the infrequency of passage of virus from the child sector into the adult sector. And that most of the time it was from adults, whether it be in a school setting or a childcare setting, in that direction, as opposed to the opposite that was previously thought. And even when family clusters are looked at, it's often the adult who's the index case, if you will, before the rest of the family, if they do become impacted in line. So that's some of the science behind what's been going on most recently. Again, I don't want us to conclude that that's a done deal. There's still more study going on, but like everything with this virus, we're learning on a very rapid timeline.
I hear you. Okay, thank you. Isla, do you want to follow up with your next question? Or do you feel like he already answered it?
I guess you answered part of it, but I just feel like it's contradictory when we've heard you advise Vermonters in the past to continue practicing social distancing until there's a vaccine. So even if we're learning more about transmission between children and adults, it still seems unsafe and contradictory to have children and adults interacting again when you're simultaneously telling people to wait and to continue to social distance until there's a vaccine.
Yeah, and I can understand where you get that sense of a disconnect in that. Again, I want to remind you that we're at a higher phase for CDC. That CDC has been very clear with the kinds of guidelines that they've laid out. We've gone along with those and probably taken them even further. So we're trying to do our best to protect health and safety as this reopening occurs.
Okay, Heather, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I can ask. So, yeah, I just had a question. It was related to children with COVID. Just, having experienced it, it's really on the forefront of my mind. So I had a few questions. One was, I find it a little bit hard to believe that it seems to me like we're making a lot of assumptions about children not being infected. The questions that I had were, how many children in Vermont have been tested? How many children have been tested as of today? And will children be tested regularly now that childcare is open? Or do we have a plan as to how to track the illness in children, just because they do tend to be more asymptomatic? And when I did look at the study, it looked like that the I think the most prominent study was in an elementary school and a high school. So those children are very different, and the setting is quite a bit different than a childcare classroom where very young children that can't socially distance are in a room for 8 to 10 hours. So just as far as young children are concerned, how many have been tested and how are we going to be tracking that as a state?
Well, I'm trying to get our website up for a second so I can answer your question.
Yeah, go ahead, Rena.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Good evening, everyone. I just wanted to weigh in while Dr. Levine's looking up data here. So I'm Brina Holmes. I'm a pediatrician. I'm just grateful for being a part of this evening, your stories and your commitment to kids and the way you framed this really unusual and awful time means a lot to me to be here and to keep talking together. To answer that, I really would like to talk to you offline, in a different setting about the plan you laid out and the pieces. There were a couple of pieces in particular that really stood out to me about healthcare access and insurance coverage, and that's just not the Vermont way. And that Health Connect thing made my stomach flip because those premiums are too high. So wanted to just put in a little. That's one of my long-standing career passions is healthcare coverage. So to speak, Heather, so important that you're sharing your own experience because it's different than the data. And I just wanted to acknowledge that when you live through something that all the news stories are saying, this is not a pediatric disease, this is of all infectious diseases I've ever seen in my career, it is one that has spared the childhood age groups significantly, but not at your house. So that falls very flat when you live through something. In the beginning of COVID in Vermont, we didn't test very many children in March and early April. And then as we increased our test supplies and felt better about that, the actual swabs and reagents, the health commissioner produced a health alert to pediatricians and said, start testing kids that are just mildly symptomatic, little runny nose, little small. They don't have to be super sick. And at that point, we saw a nice uptick in the number of pediatric tests. So now, last time I looked, which was like 6 days ago, we were at 1,700 tests in kids, and we've had about 40 cases. And I hear you that there's a lot of confusion about this asymptomatic spread and testing kids. And I'd love to send you guys some supplemental information that's not readily in front of me, which is we did a health alert looking at the pediatric cases and what the symptoms were that led to the test and what the results were. And I think that would be very interesting to you all. But I will continue to tell you, the best part of Vermont is how small we are. And we have a daily phone call at the health department with the pediatricians and the family medicine doctors in Vermont. And there's 130 docs that sign on every day. And we have 2 pediatric infectious disease doctors that join us to talk about multisystem inflammatory syndrome, of which it's very interesting to hear you describe your child's experience with some of the symptoms. I will tell you that the case definition now to require, to report this to be in line with the CDC's research is you're in the hospital, you're in shock, you're on IV fluids, I think your son had something unusual occurring. I'd love to know more, but the multisystem inflammatory syndrome case definition, we've had no one in Vermont meet that definition, and we're watching it very closely, and I certainly get it. So thanks for asking the testing question, because numerator do not, understanding how many kids are tested, how many kids are infected, it's all part of the Vermont story that I think we need to keep telling each other. But I've got these pediatric infectious disease doctors who write the national editorial saying it's less than 1% of kids. It's not a disease of early childhood. So it's a very interesting, important dialogue that we all keep learning from each other and kind of putting together personal experience with science and, so I'll go back. I'm talking too much. I'll go back on unmute, but I did want to share some more materials to come from today, because we have a lot of information for you.
And I did find on the website, the rate in the 0 to 9-year-old range is 0.2 per 10,000, which is 2 orders of magnitude less than it is for anybody between ages 30 and 80. And then it goes up much higher at 80. So it's a very, very small experience, though, as Dr. Holmes did point out, we didn't start testing kids at the very beginning. We did more in the last month or so.
Just as a follow-up, there's a article, I don't know if you saw this, someone made a comment in the chat saying that this, there's research that just came out in a science journal about schools being potential spreaders of COVID. And the question says, I'm wondering if the evidence is different for younger children. So the research that's coming out that schools potentially are places of spread, is there a sense that schools for youngest children are different in some way?
Yeah, I'd have to see that article, but you know, the articles we've been referring to, several of them were based in schools and did not show the potential for even one very ill child to infect as many as 80 close classmates in terms of close proximity. I'd have to see the study though that you're referring to.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, Johnny, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, yeah. You know, going back to Dr. Levine had said, yes, that the plan to close schools has already been made through the end of the year. And I understand that that deadline is sort of coming up for our public schools. As a side note to that, as far as I know, and speaking with my own friends who are public school teachers, much of their summer school programming has also been canceled. So many of our public schools are saying any camps or programs that are traditionally held by teachers in school buildings and on campuses are closed. So that's a secondary decision beyond the deadline. And that, you know, that those children, those 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, 9, 10-year-olds are going to go without childcare this summer. And even in our childcare centers, we're very under enrolled for parents are worried about safety. And so many of those parents, and with childcare centers closing now or having to shutter their doors temporarily for financial reasons, the majority of Vermont families are going to go without childcare. So I guess my question is broadly to the folks who are visiting, what are those parents expected to do? Parents whose kids don't have childcare. If those are parents who can't return to work because of their lack of childcare, are they allowed to stay on unemployment through the summer? And are there protections in place for their job?
I will let my CDD colleagues respond, but I did want to point out that from the Agency of Education, there is guidance that's encouraging schools to make their buildings available for summer programming. So it's not an all or none thing. There is opportunity for programming to occur in schools over the summer. But I'll let someone else talk in greater detail.
Yeah, go ahead, David. Thank you.
Thanks. Johnny, thank you for that question. We have heard of a small number of schools that have decided not to open their facilities for the summer. And we're tracking that closely along with other capacity issues. One thing that we're doing quickly, and I feel doing well, is helping programs find new space. Space that is different, space that's larger, space that is available where the space they were using before has become unavailable for whatever reason. And expediting the program's request for variances through our regulated system so that those programs can open and can serve those children. We are working very hard to make sure that when a family wants to find childcare this summer, that there will be a program open, available, and accessible to them so that they'll have that option. It's very much a new, in so many different ways, a new environment for us. We process variances all the time. That's part of our function as a regulated system. But the speed at which we're doing it now is different. And frankly, it's in response to the need. We want to make sure that we can do as much as we can from our side to help families and help children and make sure that childcare is available when and where it's needed.
So are you saying that public school, all like summer school, all public school camps, that I think we're really interested in sort of drawing clear the parallels between teachers of young children and teachers in elementary schools, and that I think often teachers of children under 5 are framed only as doing childcare and not as doing not as also being teachers, and then teachers of children over 5 are framed as being teachers and not childcare providers. And I think we feel really clear that we are, if you're teaching and taking care of children who can't take care of themselves safely alone, that you are both teachers and childcare providers. So we are teachers and childcare providers, and elementary and middle school teachers are teachers and childcare providers. And so I'm just interested as a follow-up, like if my understanding is that most public school, summer school is not opening this summer. I live in Burlington. My understanding is that none of the public school summer school is opening. Therefore, that's tons of childcare that families usually rely on that aren't getting childcare this summer. And so I'm interested in what is the plan? And we all have been explaining for all the different reasons why our programs are at very low capacity, which means a lot of families who used to have childcare in our programs won't have childcare this summer. And so what is I think that is the reality right now, that we're at even reduced capacity of childcare. And so as a follow-up, I'm interested in what are those parents, what is the expectation for those parents? Does unemployment insurance and benefits extend to them if they are unable to return to work this summer? Because some of them inherently will not have childcare.
And I'm glad that you brought up this question. And I want to reassure you and reassure all the participants that we're all looking at childcare through a similar lens, as not being just birth to 5, but also extending up to older ages as well. And that's certainly how our regulated system works. And I'm not sure what's going on with Burlington in particular, but I can tell you that we have been looking at the numbers of open and available childcare as best we can. In fact, just today we were trying to get at some of those numbers, and as with so many other things, it's challenging in this current post-closure environment to grab onto those numbers and to track them. But Melissa, would you mind sharing a little bit about our conversations earlier today about programs that are open and what we're doing to help support them in terms of tracking what's open and when programs are opening?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's Melissa Regal-Garrett. I'm the Policy Director at the Child Development Division. So since the beginning of the decision to close childcare, I've been meeting daily with the team at CDD that includes Crystal Michaud from the director, she's the Director of Childcare Licensing, Ann Rada, who runs the Childcare Financial Assistance Program, Ray Garofano, who's been responsible for professional development and STAR systems, and Heather Madison, who does our data and communication, and Jill Pearl, who is responsible for specialized childcare. The team's really been brainstorming throughout the response period and the standing up of essential childcare around how do we address capacity, because honestly, this has been an issue pre-COVID. It was an issue coming into COVID and standing up essential persons when our data system isn't able to nimbly respond and allow us to know if a program is, we can only know if a program's permanently shutting down their license. We are not able to record and track temporary closure. And now as we come out of this period, how are we supporting capacity? So frankly, a lot of this work is being done manually. Our licensors are calling folks. We have a survey that's out asking programs, are they open? How many people can they serve? Those kinds of things. And we're working with our referral network in the community agencies very locally, working directly with our child care licensors, so that as we learn of families that are not able to find childcare, we're actually making that response in an individualized and immediate fashion to try to work with programs that are open, that we are aware are open, and explore what are some other ways to potentially increase capacity in areas. We've had a lot of success with that during the essential persons, serving the essential persons families. And we hope that we're going to have similar success as we move into this unprecedented time. But frankly, Emma, the honest answer to your question is we weren't able to address capacity issues for this system prior to the COVID period because the system is a privately run system. It's not a state-run system. That puts us in a really different place as we try to support it. We try to do everything we can to encourage the building of capacity. We've got capacity building funds that are out there now in the state through the Make Way for Kids program at Let's Grow Kids. So doing what we can from a state level to pull the levers that we have available to us, knowing that it is actually a privately run system. And these are decisions that you all are making as private business owners. So Stephen, if you want to weigh in and add anything more, please do so.
Thank you, Melissa. And I hope that I answered your question. And I hope that Melissa's detail was helpful.
Yeah, and maybe this isn't a question for you. We had really hoped that Governor Scott would join us because I understand some of this is just executive order from him. And so I recognize that sometimes these questions might be a little mismatched with who actually was able to join us today. But the piece I'm really interested in is as part of a COVID relief package, so far, if parents didn't have access to childcare, they could be on unemployment, which was actually was a brilliant policy because that meant that parents were subsidized to do childcare for their own children, which is a really, really safe way to do childcare right now. Parents providing their own care right now, it really, really limits exposure. And so my question, and maybe this just isn't a question for any of you specifically, is will that policy continue given the fact that we know we're going to have huge childcare shortages this summer? Will parents continue to be able to access unemployment so they can afford to take care of their own children if either their children aren't safe to go back to school or if there isn't capacity at the school because of all of these reasons we've named?
I find that a very interesting idea. I'm not able to speak to it, unfortunately, from my position. However, I'm certainly going to bring it to my leadership for them to review and consider.
Right. Yeah, and I think we all would be really interested in talking to people after this too, if you are interested. Yeah, if you have the time.
I'd very much like that.
Yeah. Heather, do you want to ask your question? You're on mute. You're still on mute, Heather. Heather, you're on mute. Okay, Kat. Oh, are you good? You good, Heather?
I'm good. I figured it out.
Okay, great.
Okay, so I had a question, might be from Melissa, maybe Stephen. Mine really, I really want to get at the creating the new guidance. So I'm very curious if anyone that created the new guidance currently worked at or operated in an early childhood program in the last 3 years. Was there anybody specifically on the front lines on that team, or was it just made up of people that work in CDD? What was your process to identify those people? Because I really think representation is very, very important when you're passing new policies very quickly. People on the front lines will be able to really look at those policies quickly and help assess in a timely manner, what works and what doesn't, rather than checking with us after the fact, after guidance is created. So just questions about the process, who is on the team, how these people are identified.
Thank you, Heather. And I do want to say thank you for sharing your story to your family. I found that very powerful. I'm glad that you all came out the other side of it all right. As I mentioned before, CDD takes its cues on health guidance from our colleagues at Department of Health. And so I'm glad that Dr. Levine and Dr. Holmes are here, can speak to the process that they went through to develop the current guidance. I think that you'll find it very interesting, especially considering your concerns. Dr. Levine?
Sure. So this has been a really multi-pronged approach, I guess I would call it. I mentioned earlier that obviously we are very much informed by Centers for Disease Control, but also informed by the good practices that we've traditionally fostered and publicized through our maternal child health division. We made decisions based on data, based on epidemiology. We surveyed, actually CDD surveyed the childcare community. We had input from pediatricians. We had input from abundant community partners, important people, important organizations in the field, such as Building Bright Futures and Let's Grow Kids. And so, as I mentioned earlier, it was also an iterative process because feedback came along each and every step of the way. So there was a lot of input that went into this and really clarified, I think, a lot of the resources and supports throughout the process. And I know Dr. Holmes, by nature, is incredibly inclusive and very much wanting to provide a working document for people to reflect on, offer feedback on, and improve over time. So I think what we've arrived at is actually one that's being used around the country by other national child care organizations in terms of sound guidance.
And I think the question was specifically if teachers have at any point in the process have been consulted. I understand that we understand we're not doctors, so we don't have that perspective, but we do have a lot of wisdom about if guidance is actually functionally gonna work in our settings. We understand kids' developmental ages, so I'm wondering, I just wanna offer, I think the question is coming at like, were we ever included in this policy making? I understand BBF and Let's Grow Kids, and we really appreciate that. And we're speaking specifically about like us as teachers who know actually the lived experience of implementing. We had very, very strict health and safety guidelines even before COVID that sometimes were honestly pretty unmanageable. And so I think we're interested in like, was that sort of, when thinking about if we were ready to reopen, I understand that we can think about what public health might suggest as best practice, but were teachers included in considering if that actually is like a feasible ask of programs?
Teachers and then directors can help. Just directors have a really good perspective on what it costs to implement those policies in a small business. So just, what's feasible and what do you need in order to be successful when you're trying to implement those guidelines? That's all just, the representation from the people that have to actually implement it can just, I think, provide a lot of insight.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Holmes has something to add to that.
Great.
about the input.
Am I unmuted? Okay.
You're good.
Well, thank you. Essential question, and we've heard it a lot. I think with all things COVID, there were some things we wish we did differently in the beginning, but I'm super proud of the level of engagement we've had about the guidance. And I can hear, Heather, your specific question about whether you were at the, directors were at the very first day. No, we took the CDC guidance and started putting it out in webinars with you all prior to releasing it, and got tons and tons of feedback. And I wanted to try to quantify it for you so you know it was authentic. And so we estimate we've talked to over 1,000 childcare providers through webinars and the hotline at the Health Department for Public Health Nurses and emails. And we spend 20 minutes per call talking to directors, talking to teachers, talking to parents about why this isn't going to work, that the confusion about drop-off, what to do about temperature checks, not understanding cloth facial coverings, really deep concern and expertise in child development, which we are super open to. And we've already updated the guidance 3 times since beginning of April, responsive to all of the field. But it sounds like from tonight, and I'd love to talk more about this, you'd rather it be a more formal process moving forward. We are going to be iterative for weeks and months to come, and I'd love to talk together about if it would be better to have a group of you that we reach out to. What I've loved about this is it's been home-based providers, parents, big centers, small centers, parks and rec, summer camp directors, people that have kids coming over from New Hampshire, it's very, very specific of what's not going to work and what's going to work. And then there's some big things that come up in themes, and anytime there's a repeated theme, we've been collecting it and then putting it back through and re-editing. Part of the reason we don't like PDFs is because we don't want anyone to print this out and think it's solid, because the link is what gets updated, and it's so iterative. This is a novel virus that we've never seen, and we're really doing the best we can. I will tell you that CDC uses the word reasonable and feasible like 30 times in their document, which are hard to define. So you are all helping us figure out what's reasonable and feasible. And in those dialogues, we're able to make some changes. And just several of you spoke about violations or read feedback from your colleagues about that word. And maybe Melissa could speak to this more, but I do want to reassure you, this is not a punitive regulatory process, health guidance for COVID. Almost everything in the document is recommended, not required. We did say that cloth facial coverings in adults is required because it's the primary way the virus is spread. And that being said, if the science shifts or some of your feedback, we continue to look at studies together and we decide that it isn't, maybe we can make some changes in that, but we're going to keep doing it with you every week. And so I'd love to talk about if the process we think we've stood up that hearing from so many of the field isn't working, then we could maybe just form a subgroup of you all to come and every week we can update together, but it may not be as reflective of the field as what we're currently doing. I think we have to be careful about that.
Thank you. I just want to acknowledge it's 6:30, and I really, really appreciate that everyone is still here. We have 2 more questions. I think if it's okay with everyone, I'm just going to try to finish out our 2 questions. Maybe we can try to do those briefly. And then we did want to open up an opportunity for the press to ask questions. There's some press on here. Their videos are off, but they're on the call. And so, yeah, so I'm going to, if people need to get off if everyone could stay on at least until we finish questions, and I'm going to just maybe offer a little closing, and then if anyone is able to stay on and have an opportunity for the press to ask questions, that would be great. I also acknowledge that it's 6:30 and we've been talking for a while. So Kat, do you want to ask your question?
Yep, you bet. Programs that don't have many children returning will risk having payroll that exceeds their revenue. This is also compounded by the fact that offering childcare during the pandemic is estimated 23% more expensive. As was mentioned earlier, both UVM and St. Michael's Early Ed programs just closed. And we're wondering, how are you, this is a general question, going to protect programs from mass closures or job loss? And are you asking programs to close now to risk not being able to reopen, therefore kind of wasting the money that was already given? Someone had mentioned that earlier. Or is the state going to take more time to look at the actual numbers about offering stronger financial assistance than these meager reopening grants that have been offered right now?
Hi, I'm Ken Schatz. I'm the Commissioner of the Department for Children and Families. I want to try to respond to your question. We obviously are aware, as others have described, that this is uncharted territory, that there were programs that continued to provide childcare for essential workers. And we did work very hard to match open programs with families who needed and wanted childcare. The idea of the restart stipends was to address the point you're raising, that is, we did want to provide some sense of some startup money for those programs that were going to be able to open again, that were interested in willing to be open again. We understand that different providers will make different decisions, that families will make different decisions. From my perspective, it's really going to be important to keep watching and communicating and understand what's going on in our community as we reopen our economy as a whole and childcare in particular, and do our best to be flexible to meet those needs. We didn't put any penalties or sanctions or burdens on the private childcare business environment. We wanted to try to provide some incentives, which is what we hope to do with the restart stipends. We'll certainly, as I say, be very open to communicating and understanding how that's working out and do our best. We've certainly worked very hard to support the childcare industry. As others have described very well, it is an industry and a system that has been challenged before COVID. So we're very well aware of that and want to do our best to support both childcare providers and families that need it. So I really appreciate, I want to just say, as others have said, this opportunity to listen to you and want to commit to ongoing communication as we go forward to make sure we can adjust and address the needs as we actually see what's happening on the ground in your programs. Thanks.
Vicki, do you want to ask our last question before we close?
Sure. This question is for Dr. Levine. Early educators have no large-scale health care system. Would you recommend someone with no health insurance to do this job? And can you explain why? And if not, do you or maybe anyone on this call have plans to help early educators to qualify for Vermont Medicaid?
So I'll handle the first half. And I'll be blunt. I would think that pre-COVID, the positions that you are in would be challenging without health insurance. Knowing what my daughter, who has taught from kindergarten through second grade, has gone through every year that she's taught, with a strep throat here and there, a gastroenteritis here and there, I would think that it could be challenging to not have health insurance and be in your profession. So I'm saying this as a generality and not just COVID related, to be honest. In fact, most adults in the COVID era, at the most, were seeking telephone advice and were never seen in a clinical setting. And that's been a very unsatisfying thing for all concerned, but that's kind of how it's worked. And it's only the most ill who've required hospitalization that have actually interacted in any substantial way with the healthcare system, other than perhaps a test. So that's my answer to the first half of the question.
Does anyone whose job is more focused on policy have any insight about if there is a state level or legislative commitment around trying to help early educators get access to health insurance in Vermont? Go ahead.
I can add a little bit to this conversation. Unfortunately, I don't think it will be the answer that you're looking for. But my understanding is that Medicaid eligibility has shifted during the closure period. So I'd encourage Vermonters who are interested in learning more to follow up and see how those changes have affected their ability to access healthcare and health insurance.
And I don't know if you're in the, as an organizer of this meeting, Emma, I'm not sure if you have an opportunity to get this kind of data, but, you know, prior to COVID, Vermont was, I think, the second leading state behind only Massachusetts in the percentage of its population that was uninsured. So it would be very important for us to know if within one profession, the rate of uninsurance was startlingly out of proportion to that. That would be very, very important information that I know we would like to have. And we do have a Department of Vermont Health Access that would want that data as well to try to come to some informed decision about the future.
Yeah, I think many of us have a lot of anecdotal data around that. I have not seen studies or research done about that, but I also I'm also very interested in that. And I think that would be an interesting thing to follow up about to see if we could get some more information.
Yeah, perhaps a survey of some sort.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Yeah. So I just want to say a little bit to close. And then I think what I'm going to offer, it's about 6:35. I think we'll try to go until 7 and bring the press in. If you are on this call and you want to maybe make a comment in the chat, if you have a question, you can, I can call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask a question to any of us, any of the speakers, as well as the folks who've been invited. And before we end, I just want to tell a short little story. Sort of as a closing. Last year, I had a group of kids who I did a lot of work with around, we were studying nonviolent communication and we talked a lot about human needs. And one of them was a need for freedom. And months later in that year, I was sort of going back with them and trying to understand what of that curriculum they had really stuck with them. And I asked one incredible little person what made him feel free, and his answer was school. And I just, before some people get off the call, and for myself, I've just been wanting to consider, given the conditions we're living under, and given that we're living with a virus that has now killed over 100,000 people in our country, is it possible for children to be safe and healthy and free at school during a global pandemic? And I don't know the answer to that, and maybe none of us do. But I encourage us to hold that with us as we go forward and try to continue making decisions that influence the lives of young people we love very dearly. So I'm gonna shift to Peter Hirschfeld, I think at VPR. If you want to jump in, you said you have 2 quick questions.
Emma, this is Dr. Levine. I unfortunately have several phone calls that I'm behind on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emma.
I have to connect with. Sorry.
No, I appreciate it. We really, really appreciate you coming, and we'll follow up. So if anyone needs to jump off, I really understand. Peter, are you there?
All right. Yeah, I am. Both of mine were for Dr. Levine, but I'll follow up him offline.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Zuri from NBC5. Oh, were your questions also just for Dr. Levine?
Yes, they were, but I can also follow up with him later. But thank you.
Oh, okay, great, thank you. And Allison, are you there?
Yes, I am.
And do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I know that providers found out last week how much money they would receive from the Restart stipends, and I was wondering if I know that there was a lot of question about how much that would be, and I wanted to know, like, on average, about how much programs received, or if there was a range, and if there's any plans for a second round of Restart stipends.
This is Ken Schatz. I'll do my best to answer that question. So with the Restart stipends, we did have $6 million available to use for that purpose. And so we did receive approximately 800 childcare and day camp programs that did submit requests. To give you that sense, it's approximately 21,000 childcare slots that would be available this summer. And so what we have calculated is that, for example, a registered home that would be open all summer with 10 kids would receive, excuse me, approximately $3,800. A larger center that would be open all summer with 75 slots would receive about $28,500. With respect to your question about the future, at this point, we want to see how well we're doing and how things are working out before making any decisions about the future.
Are there any directors on the call? I'm just interested in giving people a sense of what those numbers, especially folks watching, like what those numbers mean in reality in terms of what expenses of running a program are. Are there any directors on the call or folks who know like the numbers of your program that can offer, so maybe the range is like $5,000 to $25,000. How many weeks of payroll is that? Yeah. Just to give us a sense.
I can speak to that a little bit. So I'm a small infant toddler program and I serve 14 families and I got about $5,000. And in terms of payroll and having an additional staff member there to help facilitate with all of the health guidelines, I can see it being about 3 weeks. And also just to mention to everyone, we did send out a survey. We had a very short window of time. We had about 48 hours that we sent a survey out to as many providers to get feedback on this. And this was one of the questions we asked. And the average range that people, after receiving the stipend, felt that it would last them about a month. That was the average. So it's certainly not looking like it's going to help even throughout the summer months.
Thanks, Kelly. Is there anyone on the press who wants to ask another question of any of us before we close? Okay. Well, great. I really, really, really appreciate you all being here. If anyone knows the governor and wants to share him our email addresses, we would also love to talk to him. I'll follow up with everyone after this and send a follow-up email if anyone is interested in talking more directly. I know many of us would be very interested to do that. Yeah, so thank you. Goodbye. I'm not in charge of the Zoom, so Alyssa.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for convening this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.